Hello, I'm Kamilah Cummings, and welcome to my presentation, Colorful People, Reclaiming the Psychedelic Soul Roots of Princes Around the World in a Day. In 1985, when Prince released Around the World in a Day, the white critical establishment hastily labeled it Prince's Beatles album, drawing comparisons to the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band album and continuing the practice of crediting musical innovation to whiteness. While this might have been expected 40 years ago, the declaration has persisted for the last 4 decades. There is no shortage of articles, personal blogs, and social media comments that insist on continuing the Beatles narrative, despite Prince himself back in 85 stating that the Beatles were not the influence. Blending funk, soul, blues, gospel, and rock with sophisticated orchestration and social commentary, Around the World in a Day is not a departure from Black musical tradition. Rather, it is a progression of it. It is a musically varied and thematically complex album that continues the tradition of musical experimentation and innovation that many of Prince's Black musical influences explored in the space of psychedelic soul, which includes psychedelic funk. So rather than dismiss a brother's words, I've chosen to accept them as an invitation to explore what might have actually influenced the album. The compulsion to cite the Beatles as the primary influence for Around the World in a Day aligns with the ideology of whiteness, which positions whiteness as the gold standard. Prince listened to all kinds of music, so it is very likely that the Beatles were an influence, but they were not the influence. This thought, however, seems incomprehensible to some. The white critical establishment, from music critics to journalists, music industry executives, scholars, and some fans, have historically situated Black artists as originators, inventors, and performers, while innovation, elevation, and sophistication are assigned to white artists who are granted license for experimentation and expansion, while Blacks are often criticized when attempting to paint outside the narrow lines allotted for Blackness. However, the few Black artists who do succeed at crossover typically have their achievements credited to whiteness in some form. Influences, bandmates, parents, spouses, cities, as we see in this quote. If it is white, it is responsible for their greatness. It's true that Prince's music is an amalgamation of all the different kinds of music that he absorbed throughout his life. This is true of Black music in general. As Michael Eric Dyson pointed out, hybridization is a Black cultural hallmark. It is precisely in stitching together various fabrics of human and artistic experience that Black music artists have expressed their genius. However, the thought that's implicit in some of these quotes is that R&B music is somehow limited, less than, and incapable of feeding Prince a complete meal. In short, he couldn't have become what he became musically without a heaping helping of whiteness. Of note here is that Prince expresses that listening to these Black singers allows one to cover all the bases. Who gets the capital? So when we're talking about capital here, we're thinking about this danger that is a result of devaluing Black music and artists that results in their legacies often fading away. There are not volumes of books or endless college courses, articles, or documentaries created that examine the brilliance of Black artists, which impacts not only their artistic legacy, but their financial legacy. As George Clinton notes here, it is not that the Beatles were not great songwriters. It's that they weren't the only great songwriters. However, they received the accolades, support, and publicity that elevated them to a level that a lot of these Black writers did not achieve. I have on this slide some of the greatest songwriters of all time who were Black. These writers are the architects of modern music whose influence is so wide you can't get around it, so low you can't get under it, yet they have not received the financial rewards that the Beatles have. And Paul McCartney himself said that Smokey Robinson was a god to them, but Smokey never made that Beatles money. So, my purpose is to present a constructive argument that not only reclaims the musical heritage of around the world in a day as a descendant of psychedelic soul, but also to honor the work of the pioneers in the genre who, like too many Black artists, have never received the accolades they deserved as musical innovators, particularly in the space of psychedelia, which is routinely presented as a white musical genre. However, artists such as the Chambers Brothers that you see here challenge that notion out the gate with their mix of gospel, soul, funk, and rock. However, their label, Columbia, initially refused to let them record their psychedelic hit song, Time Has Come Today, and told them that they had to give it to a white band on the label. Yet the brothers fought, stood their ground, released the song, it became a hit. And as we know, Prince was a fan of theirs. He sampled them, he covered one of their songs. One of the last albums he purchased was a CD of Time Has Come. So here is someone who is keyed into Black psychedelia. There are artists such as War, Shuggie Otis. I have Charles Stepney here, who we'll talk about later, Curtis Mayfield. All of these people were pioneers who were influences on Prince. However, as Ricky Vincent points out, when those pioneering Black artists do things that are innovative, those watershed events are not really recorded by the American white dominated press. Nobody bothered to take those people seriously, and it had a lot to do with the racism of the music establishment. Hence, we get the automatic knee-jerk response that Around the World in a Day is a Beatles album. So let's start looking at psychedelic soul, what it is. The time frame we're looking at is the late 60s to the mid 1970s. And this is a genre that is pioneered by Black artists. So, in short, psychedelic soul is Black music. It's a continuum of the musical innovation and evolution that Black artists have engaged in really since the beginning of time. And it just continued to expand the boundaries of what Black music is and can be sonically, lyrically, spiritually, and visually. I have some seminal pioneering uh, Black psychedelic soul albums here and artists. If you think about the signature musical elements of this genre, it's a blend of soul, funk, gospel, and blues with sonic experimentation and also psychedelic rock. Of course, there's jazz improvisation, African, Eastern, and Latin musical influences, distorted guitars, layered textures, extended vamps. You've got the orchestral arrangements, the different effects that the technology allow. There's operatic, theatrical, and cinematic elements. So there's a lot going on in this psychedelic soul gumbo. Lyrics. So when we look at the lyrics of psychedelic soul, it's more than a groundbreaking sound that comprises this music. It was a philosophy as well. It had a philosophy of freedom and love and sex and self-determination and pride. It channeled themes of Black consciousness, protest, politics, spirituality, futurism, inner peace, transcendence, and cosmic wonder. It was a beautiful time in unfolding and developing for Black artists who got to be more imaginative and political, and who also incorporated poetry and a variety of literary devices in their music. Again, some of the artists who provided this for us in this space. And then who are some of the notable players who created this music? I've got a list of them there. I'm going to go through a lot of them as influences on Prince, but I did want to point out Norman Whitfield because he was very groundbreaking and pioneering. He almost single-handedly brought Motown into the future with his innovative work in this genre with the Temptations and other artists. And of course, you've got James Brown and Isaac Hayes and Curtis Mayfield, all of these musicians who were not only expanding the boundaries of Black music, but music in general. They were also masters of their craft, which I think is important. Another aspect of the genre that I think was hugely influential on Prince, because Prince didn't become a master musician listening to, a group of guys who weren't master musicians. He was really drawn to the elite virtuosos. I also want to point out this Rob Chapman quote here, because it speaks to why we don't hear as much about these artists. Music critics have found it hard to embrace or at times even comprehend developments in African American creativity which display modernist rather than survivalist or revivalist tendencies. Such thinking simply does not allow for the existence of a Black avant-garde. It certainly doesn't allow for the existence of Black psychedelia. So let's jump into it and look at some of these artists who were hugely influential to Prince. Starting out with Stevie Wonder, he went on his phenomenal run of albums during this time period of the late 60s to the mid 70s. And most of these slides are going to be the same. If you notice, I've got the albums that the artists produced during this time, along with some songs from around the world in a day that I invite you to think about as you listen to these artists, when you revisit the album, and then just some quotes from the artists themselves. So, as Prince said, Stevie Wonder was his inspiration. He modeled himself after Stevie. He looked at the way he crafted his music and the way he played all the instruments and how self-contained he was. And also he looked to him in terms of keeping his vision clear. Stevie, in turn, saw himself in Prince as well as the greatness in Prince. So there is obviously an influence on Prince at this time, and it shows up on Around the World in a Day from Stevie Wonder. Sly and the Family Stone. Sly is the most obvious choice to me. If you were going to select a single influence, which would be a mistake when it comes to Prince, but if you were going to select one, how could you not start with Sly and the Family Stone? Unfortunately, Sly's influence on Prince is typically reduced to just the gender and racial composition of his band. It's rare that I've seen critics looking at Sly as an influence in terms of the actual music, the sonic, lyrical, and visual lineage between Sly and the Family Stone and Prince is so clear, yet we don't get that. But we also don't get a lot of exploration of Sly, period. So when George Clinton says the one who turned his head all the way around was Sly Stone, and he said he was the only one who was doing everything the Beatles were doing, but there were four of them. There was one of him. And I'll also add that Sly was his own George Martin. He didn't need a producer. So these are things that, again, when we're looking at the influence on Prince, it's obvious, and I hear it clearly on this album. Larry Graham, again, often ignored by the white critical establishment, but he was also very active in this space of psychedelic soul and funk. His association with Prince is well documented. Prince has talked about his influence on him. As he said here, he modeled his bass style after Larry Graham. He was playing his band members, Graham, Central Station Records, along with Sly and the Family Stone, and he and Larry had a connection that was rooted in their musical similarities. Parliament Funkadelic. As a Funketeer, the P-Funk influence is live and direct on this album to me. I think Tambourine is like the most Funkadelic song that Funkadelic didn't record. But throughout the album, I hear Funkadelic. And again, Prince has, screamed from the mountaintops what a huge influence Parliament Funkadelic was on him. He said it when he inducted them into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And as George said, Prince was the baddest of, the few who were actually carrying the torch of raw funk forward. And he said he knew P-Funk in and out. And Prince had been hip to us since the early days, and you hear it throughout Prince's music and on this album. Santana, Carlos Santana, my second favorite guitarist of all time after Prince. Yet, despite his distinctive guitar and signature fusion of Latin, African, blues, jazz, and rock sounds, he's often excluded from the white guys plus Jimi Hendrix fraternity of approved guitar guys. But Prince has always maintained that Santana was an influence on him. And I hear his driving music in America. Like there's Santana in that song to me. Again, another one of Prince's heroes. Uh, and it's a shame that he doesn't get enough attention, but let me get off my Santana box. Miss Shaka. Prince's love for Shaka Khan, again, is well documented. As he said himself once, he was a Shaka fanatic. He modeled his vocals after her. As Morris Day points out, he used to sing all the Shaka parts in the band. He said Sweet Thing is his jam. And what I love about it is that he's looking at her vocal prowess, but also the use of melody and the sincerity and belief and authenticity in her voice. And so when you listen to this album, keep that in mind when you're listening to his vocal performance and think about Shaka and her influence. She's rarely in the conversation of Prince influences, but she was clearly an influence. She wasn't just a collaborator. She, like Aretha Franklin, was an influence on Prince. Earth, Wind, and Fire. Prince was a huge Earth, Wind, and Fire fan. I hear them in the work of Charles Stepney on Condition of the Heart. Uh, it's well documented again. Coming up, the band covered Earth, Wind, and Fire songs. And then in turn, Earth, Wind, and Fire, covered a Prince in a New Power Generation, rather, a New Power Generation song penned by Prince. So it all comes full circle in this family of Black music. So speaking of Charles Stepney and Earth, Wind, and Fire, here is someone who is truly unsung. We know George Martin and the Beatles. We don't know Charles Stepney unless you're kind of a deep head or a music snob. Shout out to Arthur. You don't know Charles Stepney, but he, as David Hollander said, the late Charles Stepney's trademark sound, a dense mix of rich and flowing Baroque classical elements, complex and layered vocal arrangements, and pioneering use of electronic and avant-garde techniques, remains one of the most singular bodies of work created by any producer working in any genre of music. And his playground was psychedelic soul. He, during this time in a brief life, he touched so many artists with his arrangements. As Philip Bailey said, he was a genius, a musician, a songwriter, producer, an engineer, arranger, all rolled into one. And as Earth, Wind, and Fire say here, they wouldn't be the band that we know them as had they not fallen under his umbrella with him arranging and writing and producing and playing on their hit albums. But his genius extended beyond Earth, Wind, and Fire. We know Prince was being influenced by him through Earth, Wind, and Fire, but then there are these other albums that he's produced that we know Prince was listening to as well. One of them, I can't say with certainty, but Terry Collier's What Color is Love. Listen to that album and then listen to Around the World in a Day and tell me you don't hear connections between them, as well as the Electric Mud album. We know Prince worked Electric Man by Muddy Waters into his set in the years to come. So the genius of Charles Stepney was definitely influencing Prince. The DNA that he was absorbing was in Minnie Riperton. I love this quote from Andre's mother, Bernadette, where she says, Prince would be late at night in the basement playing guitar and singing along with Minnie Riperton, and her beautiful album, Come to My Garden, and her work with Rotary Connection That was all Charles Stepney, and so again, he is unsung, but if you don't know, you need to find out about him. And again, when I think of this album, I hear Charles Stepney's influence on Prince on this album. And then John L. Nelson. So when I think about Prince's music and the foundation, I start with his father, not only because he co-wrote the latter by providing the chords, but when Prince says his music is like nothing I've ever heard before, it's more complex. A lot of beautiful melodies are hidden beneath the complexity. It's a reminder that we don't know what all Prince was listening to. We don't know all his influences. So it's foolhardy or arrogant to assume that the Beatles were the influence for this album. He absorbed so many musical styles and made them his own, spoke with that language in his own voice, that it is, again, a foolhardy notion to assume that one band was the influence. And if we're talking about the Beatles, this quote from John Lennon kind of sums it up. He says, Black music was my life and still is. Of course, there's a lot of great white music these days, but it is still Black music where it is at, man. And I think this is important because often the conversation is of Black influences on the Beatles in their infancy, and as they mature, like they somehow went away from Black music. But I don't think you get to a Come Together or some of the songs on the White Album or Abbey Road without their engagement and being in conversation with what's happening in psychedelic soul and psychedelic funk at this time. This John Lennon quote is from 1972. Here are some of the albums that were number one in 1972 or singles that were number one, and they're in the genre of psychedelic soul and psychedelic funk. So to bring this to a close, this is all conjecture, right? But there's so much evidence to support Prince's assertion that the Beatles were not the influence for Around the World in a Day. So my question is, what's the harm in taking a brother at his word? Why, nearly 40 years later, is there still a compulsion to call this album a Beatles album? Why is there so much resistance to acknowledging the Black influences that make up Prince's musical family tree? As Morris expresses, Prince's music is Black music. The roots, the trunk, and most of the branches on that tree are Black. Yes, there are many twigs and leaves, room for all the diverse musical and life experiences that shaped his sound, but at the end of the day, it's Black music. So why is this important? To bring it to a close? As I previously stated, Black music legacies are rarely given the treatment of white music legacies. In his book, The Death of Rhythm and Blues, Nelson George said, Blacks create and move on, whites document and then recycle. Too often, due to a lack of familiarity with Black music, a lack of care, or both, the music that is documented is not Black music. That is, unless it can be assigned to whiteness. As such, it's important to challenge these narratives. To that end, can we finally stop talking about the Beatles and tell a proper story that situates Around the World in a Day in a new musical context, the radical, radiant, revolutionary, and soulful lineage of Black psychedelia? Thank you.